Hey everyone, what you're about to watch is another fragment of one of the free seminars that we give to the community Slack group that we have every single week. So, if you want to be a part of these seminars in the future where you can do live engagement, ask questions, etc., then join the link in the description. It's for our Slack group. You just fill out a form and then we send you the link. So, do that, join our group, and I hope to see you there. Now that we've covered how to frontline in the second rebuttal, let's get into some rebuttal strategy conversations. So this first iteration is going to be about sort of the art of the straight turn. Now, before we get into this, I want to just briefly recap what happens and what should happen in the first rebuttal and the second rebuttal. So in the first rebuttal, you want to go down the flow, right? You just want to cover their case. And you want to do it in such a way where you have excellent coverage, you're making high quality arguments, and you're also making the subsequent speech as difficult as it can possibly be in that second rebuttal. You're taking advantage of the fact that you have 4 minutes to respond to 4 minutes of constructive, and you're giving a very in-depth speech. That's sort of the goal of the first rebuttal. The goal of the second rebuttal is to do two things, right? It's to efficiently and effectively frontline in hopefully 1 to 2 minutes, to kick out of positions that you're not interested in pursuing, and then obviously to cover the opponent's case. Now, one thing I was going to mention earlier is that it's very tempting in the second rebuttal to undercover whatever the team speaking first put as their last contention. I can't count on my fingers how many times I've seen teams do that. It happens all the time. Don't do that. One thing I would recommend is, especially in the second rebuttal, you should have arguments on your flow that you have asterisks next to, that you are prepared to extemporaneously omit or not cover. And these should be non-essential arguments. So let's say it's your fourth and fifth piece of defense on a contention. That would be a great candidate. And again, the most efficient thing you can do in that second rebuttal, or not the most efficient thing, the most important thing you can do in that second rebuttal is to be efficient and to create a lot of problems for the first summary. All right, so let's get into the rebuttal strategies that teams pursue. So the first one is the straight turn. First of all, we'll talk about what this is. It means that you're reading turns and you don't read any defense that they can then concede that kicks them out of the turns. So as I explained previously, the way that you get out of turns in a normal scenario is you just concede the defense that gets read on a contention, and then that will allow you to not have to respond to all of those turns. The point here is to not do that. The point here, as the rebuttalist, is to just deliver a bunch of turns that are really good and really solid, and then force your opponents to frontline them. So, how do you do this? You want to keep a few things in mind. The first thing you need to keep in mind is that you want to have several turns available. I would say, 3 is a healthy minimum in terms of just like straight number of turns to read against a contention doing a straight turn. You can obviously read less than this, especially if it's like a really short, really blippy contention, or if you just don't have time, you can certainly read less, but I think 3 plus is a good number. I've done it where I'm reading 5 or 4 or whatever it might be. 3 plus some uniqueness responses is a pretty difficult thing to deal with in my experience, though. So that's a good starting point. So besides the number of turns, how do you do this? How do you straight turn an argument? You should read uniqueness arguments. You should do this for 2 reasons. The first reason is that reading uniqueness arguments functions as defense against a contention. And it, secondly, also functions as weighing for your turns against that contention. So if you're confused, let me explain how this works with an example. So let's think about a contention where, let's say that we're on the topic that the United States should end sanctions on Venezuela. We're thinking about an affirmative argument that says that sanctions are destroying the Venezuelan economy and it's getting worse and worse, and millions of people are in poverty. So that's the argument on the affirmative. The neg side gets up and straight turns this contention. The first thing they want to do is they want to read a uniqueness argument. Now, reading a uniqueness argument in this case would constitute an assessment of the status quo that disagrees with their argument and would then non-unique it. The way you would do this in this case could be saying something along the lines of like, no, actually, the Venezuelan economy is getting better and better. This does two things for you. The first is that it is defense against their impact, because it means their impact of people going into poverty becomes no longer true because the status quo is resolving it. The second thing is that assuming you then proceed to read turns, right? Assuming the negative team says actually long-term sanctions help the Venezuelan economy because it forces it to liberalize, it forces it to do all of these different things. If you read a turn in addition, uniqueness becomes a way that you can weigh the turn against the case. So to be specific, if you have this turn, what you can say is uniqueness controls the direction of the link. Or if you have a judge that isn't a nerd, you would use different words. But the concept uniqueness controls the direction of the link can be understood more colloquially as just the idea that the neg is defending the status quo. A uniqueness argument will generally be a reason why the status quo is in some way good. And so the argument you can make here is our uniqueness argument says the status quo is good and is solving the impact. That means you always prefer our turn to their case because the only risk of the impact occurring is if you shake up the status quo and change it. And then you would do the inverse if you were on the affirmative and you were advocating for, changing the status quo. So that's how you deal with a uniqueness argument when you're trying to deliver a straight turn strategy. It has sort of dual utility. I know this is a little bit more complicated of a concept, so feel free to ask me questions about this in our Q&A, and I would be happy to answer them. All right, so now the next thing that you want to do is you want to read reasons why their warranting is wrong that aren't mutually exclusive with your turns. So what I mean by this is that you can critique a team's warranting so long as you're not critiquing their warranting for why their link exists and then doing a link turn. So to explain, back on the Venezuela economy example, right? Let's say the team has warranting for why sanctions affect the economy. You could respond to this warranting on the negative by giving direct responses to the warranting that are critiquing the assumptions for why sanctions would specifically have a negative effect on the economy. So let's say the AF says that sanctions cut off oil exports from Petrobras, I think is the name of the Venezuelan oil company or something. And the negative could respond to this and still be doing a straight turn strategy where you can't concede this response to kick out of the turn by saying something along the lines of, actually, this doesn't destroy the Venezuelan economy because they have these other economic sectors that they could fall back on even if it wasn't for oil, right? The only thing you can't do is you can't read a piece of defense that is mutually exclusive with your turns. So let's change up that scenario a little bit. Let's say you make the same piece of analytical defense on cutting off the oil revenues not actually being a bad thing for the Venezuelan economy. If you instead said sanctions don't cut off the oil revenues, but your turns on liberalization, for example, were reliant on the idea that you cut off these revenues, and by cutting off the state-owned oil sector, you allow the private sector to grow and liberalize, et cetera, those would be mutually exclusive because you have disproven your own assumption. So again, another difficult thing to fully understand. Great teams will mess this up. They will concede pieces of defense that aren't actually mutually exclusive with turns. Safest thing is that when someone is reading a link turn, generally safe to concede a delink or a no impact? Of course, it depends. You got to use your brain. And this is something that you kind of need to have some experience with. We'll be getting into this in our summer classes, which start in about a bit under a week, or what is it, several days from now. I'll be talking a little bit more about those at the end. But yeah, this is a tough one. This is very difficult. And it's certainly one that you don't want to mess up, right? Because if you mess it up, the beauty of the straight turn is that in the back half, you can steal their contention. You can steal their argument if they don't answer the turns, and they think that they can concede a piece of defense and kick out of it. For example, in my TOC semifinals round, we actually won the round off of a straight turn on their first contention that they thought they could concede a piece of defense to kick out of, but they couldn't. The piece of defense was actually just criticizing their warrant. The criticism was not mutually exclusive with our turn, and so we were just like, yeah, that like proves our point. So yeah, don't think that you can concede things like uniqueness responses to get out of straight turns. You can't. And when you read straight turns, make sure that you're asking yourself, okay, this person says they're kicking out of this contention, but are they really? Did they actually get out of the turns? Because if they didn't and you have a link turn, what you can do is you can extend the link turn and then say, this means we get their impact. So you can extend their impact for them. And then you can weigh it, you can try to win it, etc., etc. All right. So that is the strategy of the straight turn. So now let's talk about the strategy of being super advantage heavy. This one is a little controversial. It is one you can do, but you know, a lot of judges think it's a bit abusive. And this isn't just like generally reading any advantages or disadvantages. This is sort of organizing your entire round strategy on essentially introducing one or two new contentions that you call by a different name in the rebuttal. This looks like, you know, generally having like a minute, 2 minute, 30 plus worth of advantages read at like the very top of the case or the very bottom of the case. And it usually comes with Wang. So again, by advantages, what I mean is independent offense for the affirmative. It's an independent reason why affirming is good and generates some significant impact. And of course, you can have disadvantages, which you read on the negative. So the benefit here is that you can essentially get multiple new contentions in the round if you do this. I've had a lot of teams do this to me, and it's a little unfair because you know you were supposed to read the contentions in the constructive, but you can get away with this a lot of the time, especially if you can come up with some reason why what you read is directly or indirectly responsive to the case that you are dealing with. The cost, one of them, is that it is seen as abusive by a lot of judges, so you kind of got to pick who you do this in front of a little bit carefully. Another cost is that spending a lot of time just reading like straight up independent like positions can and does trade off with however much time you can afford to spend responding to the nuances and the specifics of the constructive. All right. Actually, I'll say one more thing about the advantages strategy, just to sort of explain how you would maximize the utility of the strategy after the rebuttal ends. So once you've read these advantages, let's say you read them in first rebuttal, what you want to do is you want to pay close attention to how well they're frontlined. Then you want to ask yourself, would it be easier to go for these advantages, or would it be easier to go for case? Or would it be best to do some mixture of the two? Same principle applies if they're read in second rebuttal and things are happening between that and the first summary. All right, so rebuttal strategy, the lay narrative rebuttal. Now this is the previous two rebuttal strategies predominantly make sense in front of a more flay or tech judge, particularly a tech judge. Those strategies are more ideal for. But now let's talk about how you execute a really solid narrative style rebuttal in front of a lay judge. There are a few specific things that I would recommend doing. The first prerequisite here is that your case should also be a narrative case. That means that it focuses on one or two themes, and everything is sort of tied together in those themes. I would encourage you to even have one theme. And by theme, I mean could be an impact area. So let's say you have two different contentions. It would be great if they're both somehow about the economy, so that you can then stand up in the next speech and be like, we gave you all of this reasoning for why this policy is like the best thing you could possibly do for the economy. And the economy is the most important consideration in this debate for these three reasons. That is a fantastic way to present a narrative case. So how do you execute the strategy in the rebuttal that is based off of that case? You want to spend 30 seconds to a minute at the top of the rebuttal doing a couple of things. You want to be briefly restating your argument in case specifically, because again, repetition is key. And what you're about to do is you're about to weigh your argument. You're about to explain why your case is just better than their case. And the reason that's so critical is that lay judges oftentimes come into the round expecting to make the decision based off of whose case is better. So you're answering a question they're directly asking themselves as they're evaluating the round, which is extremely useful. So briefly restate your argument. It's like a mini extension. The next thing you want to do is you want to be presenting plain English weighing. That's critical, right? No jargon, no reversibility, no this, no that, right? Plain English weighing for why your case is the most important, or why the theme of your case, right? Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's whatever, is the most important consideration in the round. And this should hopefully be directly comparative against the theme that they are providing / the contentions that they are providing in their case. The beauty of this is that it will set you up such that the judge has a really, really good understanding of just why your case is so great and just why your case should win against that of your opponents. So yeah, that's essentially how the narrative rebuttal is done. A lot of it comes down to just like that minute of clear intro, clear comparative material, and then you want to go through and you want to give a lower quantity of responses in a lay rebuttal, obviously, and you want to really focus on warranting. Another thing I'd encourage you to do is to read the qualifications of your evidence. If you do this, it makes a lot more sense to a lay judge, because when a lay judge hears Smith 19, they don't know who Smith is, they don't know why it's Smith 19. Smith 19 of Harvard University sounds a lot better. So again, you want to make your rebuttal as much into a real narrative, as much into a real speech as you possibly can, and you don't want it to sound like just like a bunch of fragmented individual responses.